Hello everyone and welcome to this Canadian Grand Prix episode of Through the Visor. We've got some great questions from you guys from this race and it was an exciting race with lots to talk about. So let's get going. For those of you new to the channel, I've been a race driver for 20 years, winning the Red Bull kart fight and various national series, before becoming a high-performance driver coach at the world's leading race school for a decade. I was British F4 and F3 test driver, competed at the Race of Champions against current F1 drivers, and I'm a two-time champion of the Nürburgring Nordschleife. I now work as a test driver for a leading tyre manufacturer, driving on the limit every day at tracks all around the world. So first of all, let's talk about whether or not Sainz could have won the race, and why he couldn't quite get past Verstappen towards the end. So with the safety car neutralising the field, and essentially giving Sainz a slight tyre advantage over Verstappen, there was the chance that he could have chased him down and made a glorious pass to win his first ever Grand Prix. But it never quite happened. And why was this? Sainz was able to pull really close in the DRS zones. A couple of points he looked like he was potentially on for a move, but he was never quite close enough. There certainly wasn't an opportunity I saw where he could have gone for a dive bomb on the brakes, and he never had an overlap, or really even close to an overlap, to make a move on Verstappen. So we can't blame him for not making the move, but why wasn't he able to get close enough to make that move? Now this really all comes down to Red Bull's superior traction out of the slower corners on this circuit, and in particular the hairpin onto the long back straight, which was really the typical overtaking point into the final chicane. Whenever Sainz got close to Verstappen through the DRS zones earlier in the lap, he would arrive at the hairpin, maybe 6/10 behind, 7/10 behind, but when they left the hairpin, Verstappen would just stretch that gap. Now you always get this concertina effect in motorsport, where the car in front is able to get on the power earlier than the car behind, so they stretch that gap. But this was just a little bit too much in this case for Sainz to then make that ground back up again under DRS and with his superior power down the long straight. Now Verstappen may also well have cleverly been using his energy store to deploy energy at exactly the right time. I'm sure both drivers were doing this cleverly to try and maximise their advantage when they needed that extra boost of energy in the key areas, and in particular in the place where you can attack down that long straight. But really it was the exits, it was the traction that the Red Bull had, which the Ferrari just couldn't quite match despite its newer tyres. And so when Sainz ultimately locked up and threw away his final opportunity into the hairpin near the very end of the race, you can't really blame him for just trying to get as close as possible to Verstappen in order to have any chance down the long straight. And I believe, although that was the closest he'd been through the whole of that final stint, I still think Verstappen's superior traction would have put him just too far ahead down the long straight for Sainz to have made up the difference on DRS. Was Alonso's weaving a justifiable technique to keep a car behind? In short, no. The rules state very clearly that you're allowed one change of direction to defend position, and I think we can count here more than one. Alonso was being a bit cheeky. Now he tends to get away with quite a few things because people say, it's just Alonso, he's just being cheeky, he's just pushing the wording of the rules. And sometimes that's true, but in this case, it was just way beyond anything that's actually acceptable. You can't just weave left and right down a straight, because it means the car behind doesn't know where they can place their car, because it looks to them like you're going to move back into that space. And in actuality, in this case, Alonso does move all the way from one side to another several times, and even does these kind of small jinks which are just to disorientate the car behind and make them second guess which way they are going to commit to. And Bottas actually had to lift out of the throttle in order to avoid going into the back of Alonso at one point, and the stewards noted this in their post-race report. So no, this isn't on. You can't drive like this. And in addition to this, there's actually a further rule in a separate part of the rule book which says that your car may not be driven in an erratic manner which could be deemed potentially dangerous to other drivers. And I'd say this also falls under that. So Alonso's probably fallen foul of at least a couple of rules here, and hopefully we won't see much of this in the future. The 5-second penalty was fully justified. Why was Russell's engineer telling him on the radio during the safety car that he had split brakes? Now this is a term that I don't think I've heard used before, but we could probably understand it quite simply, that Russell had a differential of brake temperature across the front axle. One of his brakes on the front end was warmer than the other one. And that's not ideal because it means when he does come to commit to the brakes, he's going to get inconsistent braking performance and could potentially lock a wheel without expecting it because the brakes just aren't performing equally. Now, I would imagine on this circuit being clockwise, it was his left front that was warmer than the right front, with all the load going through the left. With the car turning right a lot, the weight is over on the left-hand side, the load tends to be on the left-hand side when you're trailing the brakes into some of these corners, and therefore that brake would naturally be a bit hotter than the one on the other side on the right. And so his engineer is just telling him during the safety car period, whilst you're warming your brakes, focus on braking whilst you're turning slightly left a little bit more. Try and equalise them so that they're a little bit more consistent and predictable once the safety car comes in. But the engineer said one further thing, which I thought was interesting. He spoke about focusing on pressure events during tyre warming. And so what he means there is, don't worry too much about warming the surface of the tyre, but focus on building tyre pressure, because the pressures will drop so much driving slowly behind the safety car. And what that means is rather than weaving and scrubbing the surface of the tyre, which is what you'd do to try and get the surface level, the tread of the tyre warmer, do things like brake firmly, which it sounds like he was doing anyway to try and equalise the temperatures, brake firmly to build pressure because of the heat coming through the brakes, through the wheel, and then into the tyre that way. And that way you're also not contributing too much to the wear of the tyre whilst you're warming it, although normal weaving isn't really wearing the tyre that much anyway. What justifies such a big changing compound between the Canadian Grand Prix and the British Grand Prix, with the hard tyre this weekend at Montreal becoming the soft tyre at Silverstone? Now this is purely down to the extremely different track characteristics of these two circuits. Montreal is all about slow, tight corners where the tyre isn't under that much load at any point. It's all about the traction out of the corners and the braking performance pretty much in a straight line, whereas Silverstone couldn't be more different. A large number of the corners are very high speed, high load and high intensity on the tyres, which are naturally going to build lots more temperature than at Montreal. If we just take a handful of corners at Silverstone, you can see that the apex speeds are dramatically higher, and therefore the tyre is just going through a lot more stress and needs to be a harder compound in order to not just fall apart during the race. So it makes complete sense that Pirelli would move up the hardness rankings of their compounds and instead move to tyres which are going to stand up to the intense stress of a track like Silverstone a lot better than the tyre compounds we've had this weekend at Montreal, which would in all likelihood fall apart within a handful of laps. Is Magnussen throwing away good results due to his aggressive attitude at the beginning of Grand Prix? I think maybe yes. At Spain, Magnussen tangled with Hamilton, which we reviewed in an earlier Through the Visor episode, and he came off badly. And again, the same kind of thing happened this weekend at Montreal. He really was looking at quite an optimistic move, positioning his car on the outside of the tight 90-degree right-left chicane that himself and Hamilton were approaching, and there wasn't really enough room for both cars to get through there, and he suffered some front wing damage, which ultimately gave him a black and orange flag and caused him to lose a lot of positions. It's bad to have to make an unscheduled pit stop at any time, but near the beginning of the race when the cars are bunched up means you naturally lose a lot of track position, and then it's very hard to recover from that during the race. And that's exactly what Magnussen found here. So Haas went from looking at a really good double points finish to a 0 points finish, with Schumacher also going out of the race due to a mechanical failure. I think Magnussen would be better served just banking his good, strong points position near the beginning of the race and trying not to get into unnecessary fights with cars which are clearly going to be miles ahead of him during the race. I never quite understand the need to fight tooth and nail against a car which you know in the long run, with the best will in the world, is just going to be past you later in the race. It would be very different if we're talking about the final couple of laps or even the final stint. But at the beginning of the race, all you're doing is losing yourself time, and that's exactly what we saw here. He lost a lot of time because of the damage. Now the black and orange flag was an interesting one because the Haas team could have just ripped off the broken piece and avoided having to actually change the whole front wing. That end plate didn't seem to be really affecting him too badly with it flapping around, so having it removed entirely also probably wasn't going to do too much damage to his pace, and they would have lost a lot fewer positions in the pit had they not been stationary so long with a very long nose change. How the hell did Tsunoda crash on the exit of the pits? Now, this one did look a little bit silly at the time, but I'll try and explain why it's not quite as much of a crime as it might have looked at first. Now, Formula One tyres leave their blankets at a lower temperature than the ideal on-track temperature, and that's actually been lowered for this year. So the tyres are not in their ideal window immediately. They then stay out of the blankets for a few seconds waiting to be fitted to the car, ebbing heat away all the time. They get fitted to the car and drive slowly down the pit lane, more temperature bleeding away, and then when you get to the braking point at the first corner, and at this track there's quite a quick pit exit which leads straight into a braking zone, it's easy to lock a wheel. Now, further extenuating circumstances may well be a bump that's down near the braking zone on the pit exit going into turn 2. Verstappen and Sainz mentioned this in their pre-podium chat in the green room, that there was a bump that you could get caught out on in the braking zone there, and that will obviously help you lock an inside wheel, particularly when the tyres are cold and if you're not really expecting it. And I think this is what happened to Tsunoda. It looked like such an extreme off. He didn't just miss the braking point slightly or run a little bit wide with a couple of miles an hour too much speed. He went into the barriers hard. He locked up early and never unlocked all the way to the wall. So I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say maybe that bump did contribute to the problem. Maybe he had a different problem entirely that we haven't heard about yet, but it's not completely silly to make a mistake like that. But having said that, he was the only one who did this all weekend, so maybe just a little bit more caution on the pit exit in future to avoid something that looks as silly as that. So predictions for Silverstone. I think it might be a better race for Mercedes, and I know a lot of people have been saying this, but what we've seen as the pattern so far is bumpy tracks, bumpier surfaces, and Mercedes suffers. Smoother tracks like Barcelona seems to come into its own a little bit more. Silverstone's also the home circuit, but it's the home circuit for Red Bull as well. Red Bull or Ferrari could also be extremely fast, but it's my hope that we're going to have a closer 3-horse race at Silverstone. I can't wait. I hope the weather's good, and I hope to see you all for the next Through the Visor episode after the race. Thanks for watching. See you then.